9:01, so I'll get started. My name is Douglas Gorman. I am a reporter here at Payload, and I cover many things in this job, but one of them being startups and the other, of course, being the European market. Today's webinar is going to cover the EU Space Act. We understand that it's still in its kind of draft mode, but it's been in the draft mode out for a few months now, so perfect time to kind of take a vibe check of what the act does. We'll get into it. So today I'm joined by Mark Boggett, who's the CEO and co-founder of Seraphim. I'm also joined by Sara Dalledonne, who's the lead EU regulations and affairs lead at the European Space Policy Institute, and then Morgane Lecas, who's the director of strategy and public affairs at Astroscale France. So just some quick background. The EU Space Act, as I said, it's very early days. It's only been out for a few months, and it's still in its draft mode, taking public comments until November. So it is likely to change in its current form before it becomes regulation, and I think we still have a few years before we really see the impacts of the act. But if you watch the kind of reporting and the news from the European Commission, its main goals were pretty clear: cutting red tape, creating more safety, and really creating this even playing field for European space regulation. So I think today the main goal of the webinar is just to speak with industry leaders, the three of us here, to really see how well the EU Space Act in its current form has approached or met the kind of goals that it stated, that, dropping regulation, creating an even playing field, and creating safety. So to start, I think I'll turn it over to Morgane. If you could give kind of a general setting the scene of the EU Space Act and some of the issues that you see, from the perspective of Astroscale France.
Yeah, thank you very much, Douglas, and good morning or afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So as you were saying, we're currently in a legislative process where the act is going through the Parliament and the Council after being issued by the European Commission. There's also, and you mentioned briefly, a public consultation that's open in July through October. Maybe it will be pushed back a bit. So stakeholders from various firms, including private companies and trade associations, can submit feedback. So we are currently, as many other companies, reviewing the act, reviewing the impact and its objectives. And just to mention also that right now in the European Union, we're under Danish presidency of the Council, which changes every 6 months. And Danish presidency made a priority of the EU Space Act. So that might also initiate a bit the discussions. So just on to a bit more detail for the audience around the general goals of this EU Space Act. It's a very heavy document, but I think we were all, especially as space lawyers, happy to see it come live. And so I've identified 4 main categories of objectives, which you touched upon. The first one and the main one, and we can see this also on the legal basis, is the harmonization of the regulatory environment. So we know in the EU, there's many different space law for each country, and some countries that don't have a space law. So the aim is really to provide an opportunity to harmonize this regulatory framework among the member states. And clarify some licensing requirements, for instance. The second is around market access and competitiveness, and I would like also to point out that there's a document around the market and the economy that was released at the same time of the act. That's also an important part of the work of the Commission. So obviously is the authorization of the EU for European actors, and we'll talk about this, I guess, in the challenges for also third-party countries, as we name them. The access to SMEs to the space industry and to this authorization and licensing process. And obviously to strengthen European autonomy, that's a big objective of the Act, while still working with this third country actor. Basically to foster a consistent and transparent environment for commercial space activity that are rising since many years. The third one, and probably my favorite one, you'll understand why as Astroscale, as an in-orbit services company, is really the aim to bring and to promote sustainable practices into space activities. So the focus of this sector on safety and sustainability, binding obligations on debris mitigation, collision avoidance, safe disposal, provision on in-orbit servicing, so refueling, active debris removal, sustainable design. I think no other provision in any EU law country has been as detailed as it wants to be. There's some Space Act, including one I know, the French Space Act, that mention sustainability and iOS, but not in detail as it does with the EU Space Act. So that's something we welcome very positively. And this also linked to the in-space operation and services pilot mission initiative by the Commission. So really having the regulation piece with the technology building and commercialization piece, that's a big objective. And the last one, and also a very important one, is the security and the oversight around the compliance, the cybersecurity that it wants to bring also around harmonizing this, especially the coordination with dual use and all these security topic linked to space activities. So I guess I'll stop here for a first intro, but the main question we've had, I said from a space operation company that in-orbit services, we really welcome the act, but we also have lots of questions and interrogations, and it's a very complex and technical text, and there's lots of room for interpretation. So yeah, I think that there's also some question we're asking ourselves, or margin for improvements, maybe on the text that we'd like to explore today with Mark and Sara.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic summarization of what is a massive, massive document. And I think that, if this was a series, we could probably do this every month for a couple of years to really dig into all the
Every
specifics.
article we do it.
Yeah. But no, I think that those are great 4 points as kind of the overarching, aims of the Space Act. And I'd love to get into some of the nitty-gritty here. I know that, yourself and Sara and Mark have been talking to, companies in the industry and your coworkers about kind of the main concerns that you have with some of these points. Because I think that there is a little bit of a disconnect between the aims and the actual texts and how they go about approaching some of these aims. So I don't know, Sara, if you wanted to jump in here and kind of give out some of the main things that jump out to you in the Space Act of unanswered questions or concerns that you might have, or the framework as it's written and what it might do when it actually becomes regulation and passed.
Of course, thank you for your question, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's really appreciated. I would like to start by saying that indeed SP really welcomed the initiative, but we also noticed that when we moved to what Morgane was presenting, so this type of aspiration, and then we try to translate into the implementation. Of course, there are open questions that rise. The way we have seen it and try to analyze at SP are really into two main categories, if we could say so. The first one is really related to what is a multi-layer governance structure of the Act. So everything that regards the harmonization, the global reach, and the governance beyond the implementation of the Act. And the second one is really more related to the technical requirements. So the fact that there is an objective of developing safe, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure, and by doing so, also fostering certain new markets and services. So if we focus on the first category, let's say, of the governance, the first question I have is related to the fact that, as was already mentioned, there are multiple national space laws. At the moment, we have 13 EU space law, national space law in the EU framework. But actually, it's sometimes difficult to find the hard evidence that this does really bring us to a complex regulatory framework or administrative burden. And even in a second step, it's really the fact that we need to start asking ourselves which type of industry and member state will really benefit or be disadvantaged by the regulation, also based on the status of their national space law. A second point is really related to the investigation power and supervision power of the Commission and the agency, which of course can also bring some certain type of legal and sovereignty concerns. It was already mentioned the applicability of the Act to non-EU companies. So this idea of the extraterritoriality of the Act and the enforcement of it. And one of the questions we started asking at ESPI is really how we're making sure that let's say, the burden of such an enforceability and extraterritoriality is not in on the EU companies, so that the EU companies do not become almost the vehicle for such extraterritoriality, as well as the aspect related to the mutual recognition that will be negotiated in terms of equivalence ruling between the EU Space Act and other non-EU space-related laws. Then, if we also look at the technical requirements, of course, there is an expertise element to be considered and a need to really leverage member states and agency technical expertise in there. And also making sure that when we look at the cost of such act, in the impact assessment is mentioned is 10% for manufacturing, 20% for launching. We're making sure that those high-level requirements and costs will not be a burden that will kind of risk discouraging innovation and entrepreneurship, especially in such a risk-taking market. As well as the fact that when we look at the technical requirements and this type of gradual regime that has been implemented, there are various requirements that reveals a few discrepancies between EU and third countries, as well as between SME and other type of companies. So also in there are a few questions can be elaborated. And I will conclude just by also mentioning the last challenge that we have identified, that it's related to the risk of forum shopping. So the fact that this type of heavy burdens could also potentially drive to some type of forum shopping in case operators will start looking into establishing themselves and seek type of authorization that, of course, are in other countries could be less stringent or more favorable or faster, etc. So I will stop here. I hope it was broad and comprehensive enough, and I'm happy to then further discuss it.
Yeah, of course. And I think that risk of forum shopping is on the forefront of everyone's mind. You know, with such a robust Space Act being proposed, there is really a risk that, you know, certain companies start to take it upon themselves to, you know, relocate certain operations or decide to launch in other countries to take advantage of, you know, certain benefits. So, Sara, if I could just stick with you for a second and just get a sense, because I think a lot of people who are going to be listening to this are going to be concerned with the kind of multi-layer structure of governance that you mentioned at the start. So can you give us a sense right now of how the EU Space Act is planning to interact with these, you know, 13 or so national space laws? Will it sit on top? Will it be, you know, companies having to satisfy, you know, both regulations when they, you know, do something like launch or plan a new mission? Is that kind of a governance structure written out in the current Space Act as it's drafted now?
So we need to start from the premise that when reading the Act, there is a multi-layer of interpretation that we can take into consideration. So that's actually my interpretation of the Act. But the situation and the challenge that will be behind balancing what is the national authorization implemented through the National Space Law and the EU Space Act is something that definitely need to be considered. As I was mentioning, also based on what is included in the National Space Law, it will be more beneficial or a disadvantage for central companies instead of others. And on top of that, you will also have to combine that with the mutual recognition. So the fact that in the case for certain third-party countries, this will be implemented as a mutual recognition, certain companies in the EU will have to then have almost a different burden in comparison to those companies. I guess the question here is really how we link into this type of authorization and licensing under the National Space Law and the authorization under the EU Space Act. I wish I have a full reply for you, but I think that's one of the questions that need to be further considered. Of course, I would say countries that will have already the streamlined process with a formal process already identified will definitely benefit, and then having to further comply with the EU Space Act, modifying it instead of starting from scratch, as in certain cases of EU member states.
Yeah, it's very interesting to understand kind of if countries that have enacted space laws now will benefit from the EU Space Act, or if it'll just be an extra layer of red tape, so to speak, especially for an act that is explicitly geared at kind of reducing that red tape. So very cool. And I definitely want to get back to kind of the third party considerations. I know that we probably have a lot of listeners in the US, and every email that I've gotten about the EU Space Act from the US seems to be quite critical. So I think that there's some actors here in the US that would like to do business in the EU without any regulations, but I think that's for another time. So Mark, I'd love to tag you in here. I understand, I think everyone else does here, that Seraphim is invested pretty heavily in a wide swath of space companies. I'd love to get a sense of your portfolio companies on kind of their first thoughts initially with the drafted EU Space Act as it stands. Do they have any kind of initial gut reactions? Do they have any things that they love or hate about it? Really just give us the kind of lowdown on what they think will be the impact of this law, if it passes in its current form.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to first of all give you my perspective as an entrepreneur, a portfolio company board member, and space tech financier. This European Space Act is boldly going where no entrepreneur dares. That's without a lawyer and a 3-year time frame. This is a really very, very complex act. I mean, it's almost overwhelmingly complex. At Seraphim, we're very supportive, very much welcome the 3 pillars of safety, resilience, and sustainability. But I have canvassed some of our 150 portfolio companies to really try and get opinions from our US portfolio companies and some of our European founders. So in the US, there's been a huge range of response, but where in some cases the EU Space Act has not even really been on their radar, and in other cases we've seen companies that have written positioning papers and are already engaged with the feedback process. So the size and stage of company really tends to determine where they are on that range. But in Europe, where there is much more visibility around this act, the feedback is almost uniformly negative, I'm afraid to report. I mean, you indicated as much, but there's a general welcoming of standardization and the elements associated to licensing, particularly traffic management and cybersecurity. And there's a belief that these will impose obligations on operators, but they should lead to positive impacts. Most of the concerns really relate to compliance overload and additional costs that are going to be incurred as overhead in aligning with this. And one of the other things that was really coming out from my discussions with the CEOs of portfolio companies was that whilst the Act makes a real effort to try and identify and draw out smaller companies, there is a sort of a track record of the EU and how they've over-regulated in the past. And again, there's fears that we're going into sort of grounds of over-regulation here. And several of the CEOs of portfolio companies felt that the lawyers were really ultimately going to be the big winners out of the introduction of this act. So what I've collated is a few of the sort of headline elements that have really been sort of provided by different members of the portfolio. So I can take you through a few of those, and perhaps we could then come back and revisit some more as we continue the discussion. So first of all, there was a sort of international concern around jurisdiction. So there's a belief that there's an aggressive assertion around jurisdiction, around the activities of other non-Europe space nations that are providing space data services in the EU. So the US players are concerned about data derived by US companies that would be considered as space-based data defined by the Act. And then they're going to have limitations about how they're going to be able to use that. And there's been claims that there's a long-standing practice in the US, largely through NOAA regulations, not to assert jurisdiction over space operations of foreign remote sensing operators. So there's a concern here that this is sort of heading in the wrong direction, that is going to lead to a misalignment between European and US and the national regimes, and that this is also going to lead to sort of a duplication of compliance effort. So that was the main sort of themes from sort of an international perspective. There were then concerns around sort of market access risks and the potential for this effectively to be hidden trade barriers with EU priorities for EU-based operators, adding friction to the overall market, and fears that other countries and regions such as the US may start to take a similar approach. So there was real fears around that. There was really fears around the value chain uncertainty, and really, just as simple as the definitions of who would be considered as an EU operator versus a non-EU operator. Lots of companies are operating in both Europe and the US. They're selling in a global market, and they've really just not been able to distinguish, where they sit within the framework that's been provided. What else should I draw out in the first instance? Of course, there's the cost element of engagement. Staying ahead is going to, or staying on top of this European Space Act as it develops and ultimately comes into law, is going to require a lot of active monitoring and potentially influence over the regulatory process. So companies are concerned that this means that they're going to have to really think about dedicating resources to Brussels, potentially even establishing for those who are outside of Europe, European offices for compliance, for lobbying, and for partnership development. So, companies are really sort of thinking about this being, a big additional tax on what is already, a rather expensive area. So I'll just pause there. I've still got a range of areas to draw out, but I just want to make sure that I'm giving Morgane and Sara sort of opportunities to perhaps comment on some of those fears that have been allayed by our portfolio companies.
Yeah, it's extremely interesting the points you bring up, because I think that in my own conversations with companies in the US and Europe, there's been a trend of late of a little bit more international partnerships being at the forefront. I think that if you've been reading Payload the last year, it seems that every week we have an announcement of a European company opening an office in the US, or a US company vice versa. And I think that there is a fear among these companies that the EU Space Act, if it is overregulated or too burdensome, will kind of stop that trend in its tracks, will slow the international cooperation, will create a little bit of a siloed effect of, let's operate in the country that is, regulatory, has the less burden, and then, deal with partner countries in a few, unique instances. But what you bring up here is very interesting, Mark, and I'd love, Morgane and Sara, your viewpoint on this. Is this kind of burden of aligning with the regulations and some of the increased fees that are a result of the EU Space Act, launch fees or operations fees for different missions? It sounds like this is a burden that will be kind of more heavily felt by smaller companies, new startups that might not have the hundreds of thousands in their bank to really just pay regulation fees. Morgane, Sara, do you have any thoughts on this kind of going forward, and if the act kind of does place a heavier burden on these smaller companies, and in effect will kind of stifle innovation in the kind of new startup space?
Yeah, so I think for us it's two ways. So we're also in France like a smaller startup. So we share some of these concerns that Mark expressed. Also to note that we're the European office of Astroscale, but we have a non-European office in Japan, in the UK, and the US. So we're really seeing these concerns also of our sisters company emerge. On the cost of authorizations, I think I discussed this also with even with some French actors. When we know currently the registration and authorization in France is free, essentially, like supported by the government. So we've had these questions of will we have to pay a fee? Will we have to register to the two? So all of these questions that Mark raised and Sara was saying, we actually don't know. It's open to interpretation. If the member state, if there is a regulation authority, will have to go with this, or we'll have to go with another EU organ that's going to be dedicated to this. I would like to bring like the other side of this for us. There's obviously the cost of this as any operators. I think there's also the opportunity that this Act wants to bring on harmonization, but especially on promoting sustainability, that for us is stimulating the market and very, very important to have a regulation like this. So I'm conscious that it's a unique position to maybe in-orbit services operator or those who are convinced to sustainability. But I think it's important to remind also that for us, it's embedding this practice into space operations. It's maybe providing more clarity toward these activities. So for an in-orbit services company, it's also a market and a growth and a revenue opportunity. And just to ping that, on this, there's still lots to clarify, especially because everything related to in-orbit services operations, so ISOs, is deferred to be implemented into what they call the implementing acts, so other documents after the EU space law, which you said at the beginning was already going to take a few years to be passed. So for now, it's like very vague how this is going to be applied. And that's where I see the risks and maybe the cost and also the delay in implementing this important, sustainability measures and measures that's going to stimulate this market. If we don't have clarity, it doesn't achieve the goal of promoting sustainability and spreading the iOS market for Europe. And a quick example is, for instance, the docking interfaces, I think mentioned in the Act. Obviously, we don't want to promote technological solutions through the Act, but at least have more clarity on the requirements around this topic. We really, I think, help the company to prepare it and maybe, budget this in their plan, like in their expenditure plan when they plan satellites, and it will help obviously our industry to work with these solutions as a routine. So I think it's really two ways for us on the cost and opportunity, and that we still see the Act as a unique opportunity to impose on all European actors the same harmonized process and to enable sustainability while being conscious that all this cost and uncertainty needs to be addressed and resolved in the next draft.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think that I've heard that from kind of companies I've spoken to as well, that it's a tough thing, to thread the needle with this large of an act. You don't want to be leaving too many things up to interpretation, but you also don't want to be regulating, specific technologies.
Yeah,
and the example that was given to me was, if we, made it so that you had to use a USB, we wouldn't have the USB-C now. So I think that leaving it open, it is a threading the needle act. So hopefully they can find the right path forward. Well, cool. I know that we only have a minute or two left, so I would just love to leave it with kind of a final comment from each of you. I think that the main driving force of this chat was just that it's still so early in the kind of regulation and deciding process for the EU Space Act and what it's going to look like in a couple of years' time. But I'd love your perspective just to end on the kind of questions that people should look out for going forward. If there's a main topic that you would want to have answered, in this kind of next draft and further proposals in the EU Space Act, what would that be? And kind of, if you have a viewpoint on what it should look like too, that would be great, just to leave people with something. Morgane, do you want to start? You were kind of...
Yeah, absolutely. So I won't repeat that. I would love to see more detail on ISOs in the implementing act. I think a topic we touched upon is the exemption. And so I think Mark and Sarah, you mentioned like the lack of clarity and over complexity. So for me, what's really important to clarify is this exemption regime. We didn't touch so much upon it. Maybe that could be a next discussion, but around the duality. So that means, for instance, if you have a dual mission or a defense mission, you may be exempt from these authorizations and all this regulatory burden we talked about. So how do you define the line? Because we know space is a dual industry by nature. And some of more detail, like the size of constellations also, like how do we put the cap? So all of these exemptions, third country exemptions, Mark mentioned it might put more burden on European actors, which we exactly the opposite of what the Act wants to achieve. So more clarity around these exemptions, I think we would really help to achieve the objective of the Act, which I think we need to reconcile with the current draft.
Yeah, very cool. Sarah, do you have any final thoughts to leave us with, things that people should keep an eye out for as this kind of draft comes together?
With the risk of repeating myself, I think something that really need to be further digging and investigated is really this multi-layer governance. So all the aspects related to the share of this responsibility between the Commission, USPA, the member states, the technical bodies that will be have to be established or are already established within the member states, as well as the role of other bodies such as the European Space Agency and so on. So how those quite large list of actors will have to deal between each other, even then when looking into supervision, investigation, and compliance and enforceability elements. So definitely the governance part is something that should be further analyzed, even in view of the timeline that we have seen. So the fact that a lot will be said by the implementing act, the certification process, and even the regulatory culture that will be established after the act. So of course, not all of this will be solved within the act per se, but will have to be seen in likely the next decade, let's say.
Yeah. Mark, any final thoughts to leave people with, things that they should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very significant piece of draft regulation that tries to really boil the ocean. It's trying to do absolutely everything. I think what we'll ultimately see is sort of small parts of this being introduced further down the line after 2027, once they've had the sort of thorough feedback from the market. So I think the onus is on people in the market to really read it and understand, what the implications are. And one of the things that we've been galvanized into doing really is to try and become a voice for at least 150 companies in our own space tech portfolio, to really sort of try and encourage them to really look at it and give us the sort of things that they want to feed back. So that's something that we're going to be sort of picking up and trying to give a voice of the early stage startup as to what is permissible, particularly thinking, as we touched on earlier, about just the trend for space being a global business, for American companies having operations in Europe and vice versa. And this is a really important trend. I think it's really valuable for building and scaling businesses. We really want to make sure that this act actually doesn't put that into reverse, because I don't necessarily think that that's good news for the domain.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that if anything, we can take away from this, 30-minute going over webinar, that we need a lot more time. So I think that keep an eye on this space. We'll definitely be reconnecting, hopefully very soon, to dig into more of the details and possibly split some of these topics out into their own dedicated webinars. But the good news is that we have many years and lots of time to spend looking at this. So I think for anyone listening, I would take the advice of the people here. Go read the Space Act, talk to your space lawyers and see how it'll impact your businesses, and then definitely make your voice heard. Make sure that while the public comments are still available, the Commission and the writers of this act understand the impacts that it could have on your businesses, to make sure that any regulation does thread that needle of trying to actually achieve the goals that they've come out and stated. So once again, Sara, Morgane, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. As I said, I think that we'll have more of these going forward. So it'd be great to stay in touch, and thank you for everyone who joined. This is the kind of start of Payload Europe. It's our first couple months, so hopefully we'll be able to dig into a lot more of these topics in future webinars. So thank you again, and yeah, have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.